The position of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is that there was a prophet in the 1800s by the name of Joseph Smith. And this prophet, by the gift of God, of revelation or by vision, was able to write down the history of an ancient people that lived on the American continent. And this book that he wrote down is called the Book of Mormon. And in the Book of Mormon, there are a lot of very steep claims. So just the fact saying that there's a man who can receive revelation from God is a huge steep claim, and one that kind of automatically, by default, you should reject. Logically, and statistically, and every other way, it's most likely not true, just because that sort of thing doesn't happen very often, and some people question whether or not it even can happen. So, lots of huge claims of this. But if you're a person who believes that these sort of things can happen, you got to wonder, well, was Joseph Smith a fraud? Was he a liar? Was he just totally delusional, hallucinating, and had a very creative imagination? Well, some of these questions can be answered by looking at his history and looking at his things that people wrote about him. But you find that there's really a lot of conflicting evidence out there. Some of it really clearly points one way, and some of it seems to really clearly point the other way, that he was a really honest, good person, and some of it really makes it look like he was just an awful person. So that's kind of hard to go off of that alone. So what about examining this book that he presented? Now, there is a lot of excitement out there over this book, and a lot of the excitement is aimed at, I guess, kind of started, when it first came out, but you can go back and look in the early history of the church. There was a man who was high up in the leadership of the church who was asked to go and try and find evidences, archaeological evidences, to support things in the Book of Mormon. So this man went out and he looked all over and tried to find the things that were described in the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon talks about a lot of things. They apparently built these ships that carried them across the ocean. They had working with iron. It mentions horses in different places. And then there was this big battle that took place where hundreds of thousands of people died. And so you'd really think, well, all right, we should be able to find some iron. We should be able to find some evidence of boat use. We should be able to find all these kinds of things, right? If it's mentioned in the Book of Mormon and the claim's legitimate, then some of this stuff should be around. Now, some of the question is, well, did the Book of Mormon take place in North America or did it take place in South America? And a lot of people are really torn on this issue. Some people are very convinced it's in South America. Some people are very convinced it's in North America. I am not going to choose a side right now, but I'll just base it off of some North American claims currently. Okay, so the Book of Mormon. Let's get started here. So first of all, the point I want to make is, does the absence of evidence prove that it never existed? I think the further back you go, the more likely it is for there to be less evidence of something. So, you go back a couple years, yeah, we should probably see some pretty clear evidence. Go back a couple hundred years, yeah, maybe not so much, maybe you would. Go back, over 1,000 years, and it's pretty likely that you may not be able to find much evidence. So I feel like someone saying that something doesn't exist based on the absence of evidence of things that existed over 1,000 years ago, or maybe close to 2,000 years ago, is not as substantial as something that maybe existed a few years ago. So one example I like to bring up was this National Geographic thing. Now, this was something that was discovered several years ago. It must have been like 15 years ago or so. They had decided, scientists and archaeologists and everybody decided that there was absolutely no way that there could be a civilization in the Amazon basin. And this is not, I'm not saying this is the Book of Mormon civilization at all. In fact, I don't think that it is. But the point here is that prior to 15 years ago, there was no evidence. They didn't have anything at all that pointed to there ever being any sort of substantial civilization. Then they did some clear cutting, and all of a sudden they're like, by satellite, what the heck are these rings? So they go around and they start digging these up, and they find, oh my gosh, there was this huge civilization and tens of thousands of people that ranged over all these kilometers, and they lived, way back, a long time ago. And anyway, so basically goes to show one discovery can really turn things on its heels. If you'd asked in the year 2000, was there ever a substantial civilization living in the Amazon basin, every archaeologist and every scientist would have said, absolutely not. In fact, such a thing is impossible. And yet, here it is. They found this thing. So, moving on to the next exhibit here, I think is, a pretty legitimate one. So, this man was sent out by the church to go find, in the early days of the church, to go find archaeological evidence. And he looked around, and he didn't find anything to support the church, and lost his testimony. I believe he even left the church over this, because he couldn't find anything about the church. All the archaeological things, grain and barley and chariots and horses and iron and all these claims they just weren't around. It just didn't exist. As far as he could tell, he couldn't find anything. In fact, originally looking, it looked like only 8 of the 60 things, cement and thrones and things like that. Only 8 of the things was found. That's only 13.3% of the 60 items were confirmed. And so, in the mid-19th century, archaeology really did not support the claims of the Book of Mormon. Now, granted, it was, close to 2,000 years after the fact, or 1,500 years after the fact. But still, they only found 8 of the 60 things, and that means the other, 52 were just, they just didn't see it. And then, now later, we found, and I guess it was back in 2005, they found 45 of the 60 items. So 1,500 years later, almost 2,000 years later, they've now found 75% of the things. And you could argue somewhere between 58 to 75%. And so, by that, that's okay. That's a bit more substantial. And some of these claims are pretty steep things that they really didn't think existed until fairly recently. So the other big stinger for a lot of people in the church is they said, well, what about the archaeological evidence? You don't see it. All right. So now it looks like, okay, we are seeing quite a bit here. Some things are still seeming to be missing. We found about 75% of them, but we're still missing the other 25. But it looks like, all right, maybe more likely than not that this could be a substantial claim. Well, what about the genetics? That's something that's new, that's come up. I mean, genetics is a fairly new field, but as far as we could tell, a number of years ago, genetics was indicating, or was looking like, all the Native Americans had this, haplo A or haplo B or whatever genetic group, and they were Asians. These people were not Semitic. They were not Jewish or Middle Eastern people at all. They were from Asia, totally unrelated. So that was a big wrench. I mean, that was kind of like the nail on the coffin of the Book of Mormon. I mean, okay, yeah, you found 75% of the items, but genetics. I mean, here it is, straight in the DNA, proof that there were never any Semitic Middle Eastern people there. Well, my understanding is that there was recently some land disputes. One of the tribes was claiming ownership over a certain area. Another tribe was claiming ownership over the same area, and they said, well, who has the right to this? And the only way they could determine whose land it was by digging up some of these sacred ancient burial grounds and then looking at the DNA of the people in there. And as they looked at the DNA, they found something a little bit disturbing for some people. See if I can find the right link here. Hold on. Oh, here it is. So they look at the DNA, and what do they find in the DNA? It says nearly one-third of the Native American genes come from West Eurasian people linked to the Middle East and Europe. Whoa! Now this is a National Geographic publishing this here. So, and then they trace it back. They find the youth, going way back. It's in 24. Kind of goes on, talks about that. You look at the article. The article is not saying that they were all Jews, but the only thing the article is supporting is saying that what they found. What they found is that 1/3 Native American genes come from someone linked to the Middle East. Now, we can't tell with genetics when it was introduced or who was first, and they come through a lot of theories, based on these different things. But that is an interesting finding. So they call it the Haplo X group is what they found. So it looks like, the Hopewell Indians seem to match the time period pretty well. So let's see, where was I here? So here's the Hopewell Indians. This is the Smithsonian. So it looks like the white settlers buried the truth about the Midwest's mysterious mound cities. So these people, pioneers and archaeologists, to credit distant civilizations, not Native Americans, with building these sophisticated complexes. So there was this huge civilization here. They existed, probably around the right time. But the thing here that's so tricky is this is even still, what is it, something like 700 years after the last event in the Book of Mormon. So this is all they could find of this civilization. They got tens of thousands of people in it. And just in the city alone, there's this kind of outline of what they thought the city might have been like. And that's, many hundreds of years after the last person recorded in the Book of Mormon. So that means that, the further back you go, the more likely there is to be even more people, or even more evidence lost, rather. So anyway, great article. So none of these, of course, are proving it. All I'm doing here is making a case to say, let's look at both sides. Let's look at the possibilities. Some people are very decidedly, absolutely no evidence, no way, no possibility. I'm saying, well, I don't know the answers, but let's look at what we found. So now we found 75% of the objects were discovered, and that now we found there was a large civilization that existed even 700 years after, and we barely have even evidence of them. So who knows what would have been there, almost 1,000 years earlier. And so just kind of opening your eyes to the possibilities here. So I think I already talked about that one. Already. Okay, so there's arguments about whether it's South America or North America. Some people, feel like this was the narrow neck of land, and this is over here, and this is over there, and that's kind of where this all took place. Sarah Hemla and Bountiful and all that kind of stuff. Well, there's another argument, though, that says it's probably up here where the genes are located. So the Semitic genes that they found are kind of more in this region, around in here, like all this kind of area. The Hopewell Indians is kind of in that area. In fact, if you look here at the Hopewell Indians, kind of centered around here is the narrow neck of land being right here. This is the Sea East, this is the Sea West, and described in the Book of Mormon. And if you compare this like the Sea of Galilee, these are larger than the Sea of Galilee, so it makes sense that they would call it that. But you find all these like really complex things this is a National Geographic website. A lot of complex things they had here, like silver and and copper and all these kinds of things from all over the place that they brought, mica and stuff. Anyway, so kind of interesting. There's still some things that are missing. Here's another thing they found from the Hopewells that seems to match the time. Also, the Olmecs seem to match up pretty well with the Jaredites. So I find the Olmecs on here. Olmecs was a group. Where were they here? Anyway, so interesting stuff. Let's go over here though. So all right, so I guess I'll go to this now. So one of the big problems was, where the heck are the horses? Now it mentions here in the Book of Mormon there was a particular time when Ammon is feeding the king's horses, and then the king goes on a chariot, we're assuming drawn by the horses, and then there's another instance where all the Nephites are gathering together for the big battle with the Gadian robbers, and they take all their chariots and they bring them to the center of their land. But other than those two instances and some references to quotations from the book of Isaiah, there's no mention anywhere of anyone actually riding a horse, which is weird to me. If there's horses around, people should be riding them. There's a lot of mention of this sort of thing in other places, in other books, but not in the Book of Mormon. Why aren't they riding the horses? Why is it just mentioned like a chariot? I don't know. I don't have the answer to this. So there's a couple of possibilities here. So where are the horses? Never an instance of anyone ever riding a horse in the Book of Mormon. And I already mentioned that. So possibilities here. Mentioned Book of Mormon, horses, but why do we not see any evidences of horses in America during that time period, as far as we can tell? One possibility was Joseph Smith was a fraud. He's a charlatan, a liar, or a delusional kind of genius sort of person, creative genius. Made up the whole thing, but he was just too uneducated to realize that there were no horses in America prior to the English, and now his mistake is obvious. So that's one possibility. Could be that he's a fraud. That's, if we were to look at this from a statistical standpoint, based on the height of his claims, that would be the most likely statistically and maybe even logically for most people to come to that conclusion. Very reasonable conclusion to come to, that he was a fraud or delusional. Another possibility, if you have reasons to believe the Book of Mormon, as I do, is that this was not a mistake. That they actually did have horses, but we just don't have any evidence of it because it was like 2,000 years ago. And a lot could have happened in that time. And I mentioned the buffalo here. I'll bring that up a little bit later. Remember, I mentioned the buffalo in reference to the horses. So, now, the kind of weird thing about this claim, though, is I got to say, is it just seems like you'd find something. I mean, you'd find a horse carcass somewhere or something, somehow. I know it was 2,000 years ago, but I don't know. It just seems like they'd find something. And also, it just seems weird that nobody ever rode the horses. So I know it says the word horse, but why doesn't it ever mention anybody riding the horses? And one time, one person being drawn in a chariot as a king seems kind of weird to me. So there's two other possibilities here. One is that this could have been a Joseph language mistake. In other words, Joseph's mistake. I don't know exactly how the process of revelation works, but it seems like there is a scripture that talks about how God speaks unto men according to their own language, according to their understanding. And in Joseph's language, in his understanding, when a chariot is being drawn, his language, his understanding would say the animal that draws a chariot is going to be a horse. And so when it talks about an animal drawing a chariot, his language, his mind comes up with the word horse, even though maybe that wasn't the actual animal being used. Maybe it was a buffalo or a goat or a pig or something else. Who knows? I don't know how Revelation works, and I don't know a lot of people that do. So to say that that's out of the question, that Joseph Smith's mind could have had to, basically came up with the wrong animal, or was coming up with an animal based on function, is one thing. The other possibility is maybe rather than it being a Joseph mistake, it could have been a Nephite language mistake. Maybe the Nephites, goodness, when the person wrote the word horse, it could have been, that there wasn't a word for buffalo. And so the word in Reformed Egyptian for buffalo, the closest thing they could have for an animal that pulls a chariot, is a horse. And so that's why he said horse rather than some other kind of animal. So, someone will say, well, you can't ride buffaloes anyways. Yeah, I don't think you really buy it. But there is this funny thing, you can YouTube it. It's called The Guy on a Buffalo or something like that. So apparently people can ride them. But anyway, the question then would be, the Nephites wrote down the word horse in Reformed Egyptian because they had no other word to describe the animal that they used to pull the chariots around. This would make the most sense because no one has ever recorded riding one in the Book of Mormon. Okay, now what about the iron swords, though, right? There's this huge battle. There's like hundreds of thousands of people that die. Can't find an iron sword anywhere. So the conclusion must be there's no iron swords, right? Well, maybe, could be. Let's talk about this. Why can't we find also the hundreds of thousands of dead bodies in a war that took place about 1,500 years ago? So possibilities here could be there was no such battle, and Joseph Smith is a liar or delusional. That is probably the most likely option, again, from a statistical or logical viewpoint for most people, if you don't have a reason to believe the Book of Mormon. If you do have some other reason to believe the Book of Mormon, there's some other options that might make more sense to you. Maybe you just haven't dug in the right place yet. Although it seems like, there's a lot of people in America, and we would have found it somewhere, that's a lot of bodies, a lot of iron, if it's still around. So one possibility is that the bodies all decayed to dirt or were scavenged or pillaged over a period of 1,500 years, and maybe the iron rusted away to dust, or maybe it was gathered up by generations over the next, would that be like 15, 20 generations or something, maybe more than that, over the next, 1,500 years. Then I bring up a point here now. Remember I mentioned earlier the horses disappearing, and I don't necessarily believe there were horses there. I don't know. But it says there were 30 to 60 million. Let me go to the website there. Hold on. There we go. So historians estimate there were perhaps 30 to 60 million American bison. Okay. This is wandering the plains in the 19th century. But by the 1880s, a few hundred wild bison, living in the Yellowstone Park were among the last that remained. Okay, so I drove around that area where the bison used to be, 30 to 60 million of them, and I didn't see one bison carcass. I didn't see one bison bone anywhere in my time there. I was there for weeks. So where are the bison bones? Shouldn't there be, if there was 30 to 60 million of them, shouldn't we find 30 to 60 million bison bones? I don't see them. This was only a couple hundred years ago. So people say, well, if there's this many bodies, then there should be, or this many bison, there should be that many bodies. And some people say, well, if there was 100,000 Nephites and Lamanites killed, hundreds of thousands, then there should be hundreds of thousands of bodies. Well, this was only a couple hundred years ago. That was like almost 2,000 years ago. And so unless you can find 30 to 60 million bison, however many bison bodies you can find, now, let's say we find 3 to 6,000. Okay, so that's, I'm not good at math, but if you take, the ratio between of 1,000 to 1,000,000, that's like a fraction of the number. Now, if you were to extend that over, how many would we find 2,000 years from now? Whatever number that is should be the same number of bodies you should find of American Nephites and Lamanites, if we're going to make the same claim. So that's something that you have to kind of calculate. So tell you what, 1,500 years from now, ish, we can look at it, and however many bison you find in the ground should be the number of Nephites and Lamanites that we should be able to find. Same ratio there, using that same logic. I don't think you're going to find many bison. So that I say that, probably decayed. Anyway, does this mean that this is proof of the Book of Mormon? Nope. All I'm saying is that you don't have proof, really, really sure proof, that the Book of Mormon is false based on the claims that you can't find horses, or you can't find iron, or you can't find 100,000 dead bodies, or a couple 100,000, or whatever dead bodies, that there actually was Jewish DNA in that group, in that area, Middle Eastern DNA. So you can't make the DNA argument anymore. There was some DNA there, and it's Semitic in origin. So actually, that's the opposite case there. So also, you can't say that there was no huge civilization there, because 700 years after the final event in the Book of Mormon, there actually was huge civilizations around. So can't really say that either. So who knows what might have been there 700 years earlier. Anyway, all I'm just saying is some people really get excited about the absence of absolute definitive proof. Hey, I haven't found my own set of golden plates, and therefore there was no golden plates. And they'll get really excited about that. I'm not saying that there's archaeological proof saying that for sure the Book of Mormon happened, but I'm saying that just be, I don't know, be a little more less positive of something when there actually is some evidence there that goes the other way around. Anyway, best luck to you. Hopefully that was interesting for you and informative.